You're not bad with money because you don't understand it. That's the lie that's been quietly ruining your financial life while making you feel intelligent at the same time. Because here's the uncomfortable contradiction you keep running into. You do understand what you should be doing, but you still don't do it. And the more you think about it, the less sense it makes. You've read the advice, you've watched the videos, you've even explained it to other people like you figured it out, but your bank account doesn't reflect any of that, and that creates a strange tension inside you. Because if you're smart, then why does your financial life feel like it's always one mistake away from chaos? Here's the part nobody says out loud. Your intelligence might actually be part of the problem, because being smart doesn't just mean you understand things faster. It also means you become better at explaining why you don't need to change yet. And that tiny gap between knowing and doing is where most people quietly stay stuck for years. But there's something deeper happening underneath that gap. Something that has nothing to do with budgeting, discipline, or income. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. The question is, why does your intelligence keep working against your money decisions instead of improving them? You're going to notice something in the next few minutes that might feel slightly uncomfortable. Not because it's complex, but because it's familiar. We're going to break down why smart people repeatedly sabotage their own financial progress without realizing it. And more importantly, why the very traits that make someone successful on paper often create blind spots in real life. But this isn't going to be about budgeting tricks or investment strategies. You already know more of that than you're using. This is about the hidden identity loop that controls what you do after you already know what's right. And once you see it clearly, it stops feeling like a motivation problem. It starts looking like something else entirely. Something more personal. Something quieter. And a lot harder to ignore. Because the real reason you're stuck might not be lack of knowledge, but the way you protect your image of yourself when money forces uncomfortable decisions. And that's where everything starts to split. There's a moment that plays out in almost every smart person's life. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Nobody notices it happening. But inside, it's a small negotiation that changes their financial direction every single time. Imagine someone sitting alone at night, looking at their bank balance. They already know what it's going to say. It's not a surprise anymore. There's a pattern they've been avoiding looking at too closely. They tell themselves, this is the month I fix it. And they mean it. Then something happens the next day. A course they've been wanting goes on sale. Or a friend suggests a dinner. Or they convince themselves they've earned a small reward for all the stress they've been under. And just like that, the serious financial plan gets postponed again. Now here's where intelligence quietly enters the picture. Because this person doesn't just spend impulsively, they justify it elegantly. They build a narrative that makes the decision feel reasonable, even responsible. I'll make it back next month. I need balance, not restriction. I can't be too rigid or I'll burn out. And the scary part is, those aren't irrational thoughts. They sound mature, balanced, even wise. But underneath all of it is something else, a subtle refusal to experience discomfort. Because the moment they fully commit to financial discipline, something uncomfortable shows up. Identity conflict. Now they have to face a version of themselves who says no, who delays gratification, who might disappoint others, who might feel less free in the short term. And for someone who sees themselves as smart, capable, and in control, that identity shift feels like a downgrade. So instead, they stay in the loop where they are always about to get serious. Not failing, not succeeding, just intelligent enough to understand the problem, but not yet committed enough to become someone different. And over time, this creates a dangerous illusion, the belief that understanding equals progress. But nothing actually changes. And here's where it gets more interesting. Because there is another type of person in the exact same situation who reacts completely differently. And their outcome eventually splits so far apart, it looks like luck from the outside. But it isn't luck. It's identity friction, or the lack of it. There's a version of the same story that plays out differently. Same income level, same knowledge, same access to advice. But when they feel the urge to spend on something unnecessary, something subtle happens in their mind. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" they ask, "What version of me is making this decision?" That small shift changes everything. Because now the decision is no longer about money. It's about identity consistency. One version of them is impulsive, but emotionally justified. The other version is boring, structured, and future-focused. And the discomfort is real, Because choosing discipline doesn't feel like a financial choice. It feels like rejecting a part of yourself that wants comfort right now. Most people never consciously experience it this way. They just feel internal resistance and call it lack of motivation. But it's not motivation. It's identity resistance. And here's the part nobody really explains clearly. Smart people are actually more vulnerable to this loop, not less. Because intelligence gives you more tools to rationalize inconsistency. You can argue your way out of almost any commitment. You can always find a logical exception. One unexpected insight that changes everything is this. Your brain doesn't protect your money. It protects your self-image. So if being financially disciplined threatens the image of you as flexible, free, or not obsessive about money, your mind will quietly sabotage consistency to maintain that image, even if it costs you more in the long run. That's why people can stay stuck for years while knowing exactly what to do. Not because they lack clarity, but because clarity alone doesn't override identity comfort. So now the real question becomes unavoidable. If intelligence isn't the missing piece, and knowledge isn't the missing piece, what actually is? The real reason smart people struggle with money isn't that they don't take action. It's that they take action in a way that never threatens who they think they are. And that changes everything, because once you see this clearly, you start noticing a pattern. The decisions that would actually improve their financial life are the exact decisions that feel slightly off-brand for them. Not dangerous, not impossible, just not aligned with their self-image. So they avoid them, or delay them, or soften them until they're no longer powerful enough to matter. Here's what's really happening underneath it. Your brain is running a silent protection system. It constantly tries to prevent internal conflict between two versions of you. The version you think you are, and the version you would need to become to get different results. And conflict feels expensive, not financially, psychologically. Because if you suddenly become strict with money, say no more often, and start thinking long-term in a serious way, then you have to face something uncomfortable. You weren't that person before, and your mind doesn't like that implication. It prefers continuity, a stable story about who you are. So instead of changing behavior, it protects the story. Think of it like a thermostat in a room. If the temperature rises too far above what feels familiar, it doesn't stay there. It pulls things back down automatically, not because higher temperature is bad, but because it's unfamiliar. Your identity works the same way. It resists financial behaviors that feel like they belong to a different type of person. And here's the twist that most people never see clearly. The more intelligent you are, the more sophisticated your thermostat becomes. You don't just feel resistance. You explain resistance. You turn hesitation into logic. You turn avoidance into strategy. You turn inconsistency into reasonable flexibility. So you stay in motion without ever actually crossing the threshold where identity has to change. And that's why it feels like you're always learning, always improving, always getting closer, but never actually becoming. Because becoming requires something learning does not. A break in identity continuity. A moment where you act like someone you haven't fully become yet. And that's exactly what your brain resists most. Which leads to the real turning point most people never reach. If your current identity automatically rejects the behaviors required for financial growth, then no amount of knowledge will ever feel like enough. So what do you do when the problem isn't understanding, but identity itself? That's where everything starts to shift. Because there is one simple behavior that begins to weaken this entire loop, without requiring you to become a completely different person overnight. And it looks almost too small to matter. But it changes the direction of everything. The question is, would you actually do it when it counts? The shift doesn't start with better discipline. It starts with a single repeated moment of discomfort you stop avoiding. Not a system, not a plan, not a financial overhaul. Just this, the pause between impulse and action. Because right now, that gap is where everything collapses. You feel the urge to spend, upgrade, escape, or delay. And almost instantly, your mind fills the silence with justification. You don't even notice the decision being made. It feels automatic, clean, familiar. So the core change isn't stop spending. It's noticing the exact second your brain tries to protect your identity with a story, and then doing something rare. You don't argue with it. You don't obey it. You just pause long enough for the story to lose its grip. That pause is uncomfortable at first because it removes the autopilot. And without autopilot, you're forced into a moment of identity exposure. Now it's just you and the decision. And in that moment, something subtle happens. The version of you that always reacts immediately starts to weaken, not because it's attacked, but because it's interrupted. Most people think change comes from adding more control. It doesn't. It comes from breaking the speed of justification, because your financial patterns don't come from lack of intelligence. They come from decisions made too quickly for identity to be questioned. So the real practice is simple, but not easy. You delay the identity response, even if it's just for a few seconds. That's enough to create space where a different version of you can exist, even briefly. A version that doesn't need to justify everything. A version that can choose discomfort without turning it into a narrative. And the more often you do this, the more your identity stops being fixed and starts becoming flexible. Not overnight, but enough to change direction. And that's where financial change actually begins. Not in knowledge, not in motivation, but in the first moment you stop letting your brain speak before you've even had a chance to think. Remember that contradiction from the beginning? How you can understand money deeply, explain it clearly, even advise others, and still feel like your own financial life doesn't match your intelligence? That wasn't a mystery. It was speed, not lack of knowledge, not lack of effort, just decisions happening faster than identity awareness can catch up. And the strange truth is this: smart people don't fail with money because they think too little. They fail because they think just fast enough to avoid discomfort. Once you slow that gap down, even slightly, the pattern stops feeling inevitable. It starts feeling optional. And that changes everything. Because the moment you realize your financial behavior isn't fixed, it was just unobserved. You stop trying to fix yourself and start observing yourself instead. And that version of you, that's where change actually begins. Not the version that knows more, the version that finally pauses long enough to act differently. And once you see that gap clearly, you'll notice it everywhere. Not just with money, but with every decision you thought you were already in control of. If this made sense in a way you didn't expect, the next step isn't learning more, it's noticing more, right when it matters most.